Okay, let's take a look at changing the index page of our colors example so that instead of using an array of arrays, loading data straight from a text file the way that we've been doing previously, instead what I'd like to create a color class so that we can then create color objects, and it'll be an array of those color objects that we'll want to set up our index page to use instead. I've already started a new file called color.php, and it's in this new file that I'm going to create my color class. So let me start with class color here. Instead of digging right in immediately to converting the index page over to using the color class, let's start off a little bit slower and begin by just creating a color class that can store the basic data that our color is going to need so that we effectively have something to build on at that point. There are different ways that I could potentially store my color data inside color objects created from this class. Basically, our colors consist of an ID number, a name, a red value, a green value, and a blue value. And I could put together my color class where I create individual variables for each one of those different attributes. But I think what I'm going to do instead is in my color class, I'm going to create a private array. I'm going to call it attributes. And into that attributes array, which I'm going to start off as just an empty array, I think, that's where I'll actually store all the different pieces of data for each one of my new colors that actually gets created. As a matter of fact, what I might do is I might go ahead and start us off so that whenever we do create a new color, its attribute array maybe already contains some default values for a new color. So I could say that every new color that's created starts off with an ID of, let's say, 0. We'll just use 0 as sort of a default until a real ID has been assigned. I'll say every new color starts off with a name. The name I'll start off with will just be blank, so a new color won't have a name initially. And I think I'll do essentially that same thing for the red value, green value, and blue value. Set up each one of them so that they actually start off blank. There we are. So any new color I create will now start with this particular set of attributes stored inside of it. Now, when I create a new color, I would probably like to have a constructor that would make it fairly easy for me to be able to make that new color. So let me create a new public function. I'm going to call it __ construct, as is required of a constructor. And again, I have a bit of a choice to make in that with this constructor, I could pass it individually an ID, a name, a red value, a green value, and a blue value. But I think what I might do instead is I might just assume that it's going to be passed an associative array. The reason I'm thinking I might set my constructor up to be passed an associative array is I think that in a number of different situations as I go through and work on this example, that is going to be the format that my data is already in. I'm thinking that when I pull my data out of my file, that data will come out of the file basically as an array from the extract function is where that will probably happen. There'll be times on the new and the edit page when I'll be working with data about colors that were submitted as part of a form, so those will be in the post array most likely. So it seems like when I have color data outside the color class itself that I want to get into the color class, that I essentially want to turn into a color object, it seems like a lot of times, at least to me, in thinking about it, it seems like a lot of those times that color is going to start off, that color data is going to start off as some type of an array. So I'm thinking that might be the easiest way to get that data into my new color objects. Just in case I ever want to create a blank color object, maybe I'll start off with just a blank array, or maybe not even needing to bother to do that. Since I've already initialized my attributes up here, we could essentially just sort of ignore it. Maybe instead of doing a blank array, what I'll do is I'll say if no array is passed, just set the data equal to null. Assume that there's nothing there. Then inside the constructor itself, I could do something like say if not data. So that would essentially mean if data is not null. Actually, it's the other way around that I want that. I'll say if data. So if we actually do have some data, if data isn't null then what I would want to do is take the values out of data and actually store it in the attributes array. So I could do that by storing the data directly into the attributes array. I could say something like $this attributes element ID would equal from the data array, the value that was passed in called ID. And that should work okay. That would take the ID that's actually coming in as part of the data that was passed to the constructor, if any data was passed to the constructor at all, and that would put it into my attributes array under the key ID, essentially replacing the 0 that I put in up here as the default for the ID. The one thing I don't like about that is that there's not any kind of validation taking place there. And to be honest, at this point with my color class, I'm not exactly sure where or when I want to do my validation, but it bothers me a little bit that it's actually kind of bypassing any possibility of data validation at this point. What I'm thinking is maybe instead of doing it this way, what I should do instead is I should set this up so that I do it like this. I'll say for this new object that's being created into its ID, put in the value that's coming in under the ID key of the data array. Now, the way things work right now, that would actually create a new standalone variable called ID in the new color object and assign it the value from the data array. And that's not exactly what I want either. But something I think I might do here in a minute is I might come back and put in a set function, an underscore underscore set function, which is what would then actually end up being called when I run this particular line of code. Even though this line of code is inside the class itself, it'll still execute the set function automatically because it'll see me assigning a value to an attribute of this object. That set function then could potentially become a fairly easy place for me to be able to put in my validation. It also cleans up the constructor a little bit. I like the look of this a whole lot better than what I had there a minute ago where I was assigning values directly to the attributes array. So let me go ahead and handle the other attributes this same basic way. I'll assign the name value to the name. I'll assign the red value to the red value, the green value to the green value, and last but not least, the blue value to the blue value. There. I think that might be a decent constructor to get us started. Let's go ahead and move on from there, and when we give it a try here in a little bit, we'll see if that actually works or not. Next thing I might go ahead and put in then is the underscore underscore set function that I mentioned a minute ago. Let me go ahead and get that set up. The underscore underscore set function will always be past the name of the attribute that we're trying to set and the value we're trying to set it to. This is the function that will actually be called up here in the constructor whenever I try to assign a value to one of my attributes. And here what I essentially want to actually happen is I'll say into this object's attributes array, into a key of that array that has name as the key, I want to assign whatever value is coming in. So that would essentially mean whenever I do a line something like this name equals something, or if I do something like, say I have a color object and I say set its red value equal to FF, in either of those two types of scenarios, this function will end up being called. In the first scenario, the name variable will actually have stored in it name, which would mean that into my attributes array, into the key of name, we would store the value. The value would be something in that particular case. In the second scenario, red value is what I would be assigning. That should be an underscore there. Red value is what I'd be assigning. So red value would be the value of the name variable. So it would be into the red value key of my attributes array that the value would be assigned. And in that case, the value would be FF. So this would later potentially be a good place for me to be able to put in any validation that I wanted to do, as this becomes essentially the single point where values are actually going to be stored in my attributes array for every new color. All right. There's of course also then going to be the possibility that I'm going to want to be able to retrieve individual values, individual attributes from a color object. So for that, I'm probably going to want to put in an underscore underscore get function. The get function will simply be told the name of the thing that we want to get. Since all of my values are in my attributes array, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to return whatever value is in the attributes array for the key of name, whatever name happens to be. So again, this is something that would happen if we did something like said name, this name, or if we had, say, a color object called C, and we said give me the red value. In either of those two cases, either name or red value would be the value of the name variable being passed here to the get function. So it would then be either name or red value that were used as the key for my attributes array, and the corresponding value stored in the array, if it exists, would be returned. That seems like a pretty decent little start to our color class. It's all fairly basic. Here, honestly, this actually, in a lot of ways, doesn't have a whole lot to do with colors. Just about any new PHP class that I start off would probably start off something relatively similar to this. So let's see how we could actually then maybe use it. My actual index page right now, what we're doing is we're doing a require for our color file, then we're calling a load color function from that file. That load colors function is what's returning our colors array here, which at the moment is actually an array of values. And that's part of where I'm going to need to integrate in my color class now. One of the first things I need to not forget to do, though, is I'm going to need to actually include my colors class. So my colors class is in a file called color.php, so I'm going to put in a require for that, so that at least at that point I have access to my color class. Now, the next step I think I might take is let's go take a look at this load color function. My load color function here is here inside this file called colors lib. What it does is it takes the file name, the name of the file that we're pulling the actual data from. It then creates a colors array. It pulls each individual line out of the file. It loops through all the lines from the file. It explodes each line from the file. That line there leaves us with a thing called fields, which is actually an array, a numeric array, containing all the individual values about one individual color. Each color is read sequentially as we do that, going through this for each loop. Each time we read one of those new colors, we take it and we actually put it into the colors array, and then that colors array is what gets returned. It seems like this is probably a good first place where I could start integrating in my color class. What I could do is, instead of creating this subarray here called color and then putting that into the colors array, what I could do instead here is maybe create an object instead. So let's give that a try. What if I said $color is a new color? That would call the constructor for my color class, and you remember, I hope, that we set up our constructor so that it would take an associative array. Little bit of a mismatch here because I don't have an associative array with fields. What I have there instead is I have a numeric array, but I could certainly turn one into the other. I could go ahead and create a new array here, and into this array I'm going to want to put in a value for an ID. I'm going to want to put in a value for a name. I'm going to want to put in a value for the red value. I'm going to want to put in a value for the green value, and I'm going to want to put in a value for the blue value. And in this particular case, where those values would actually be coming from would be from my fields array, that numeric array. So the ID itself would come from fields element 0. The name would come from fields element 1, so on and so forth for the red, green, and blue values. Red comes from element 2, green from element 3, and finally blue from element 4. So the same values I was taking out of the fields array down here below and putting them into an associative array called color, what I'm doing now is I'm also, again, creating an associative array, essentially the same way I was here below, just with a slightly different syntax, initializing the array with the values instead of creating the array empty and then putting the values in after the fact. That associative array is being created. It's then being passed to the constructor for my color class, so a new color object will be created instead. That should then mean all of this code right here can now go away. Okay, once I have that new color object created, that new color object can then be put here into the colors array. The difference is now we don't have a key called ID because color is no longer an associative array, color is an object. So let me access the ID but do it in an object sort of way. So I'll say for the ID value in my color object, use that as the index number for the colors array to store that color, to actually assign that color to that element. Once that's all done, my color array now, colors array I should say, will be full of color objects, or at least it should be, and then that's what will actually be returned. So on my index page now, when we call the load colors function, instead of getting back an array of arrays, we'll get back an array of objects. So the colors array here should be an array of objects. How is that going to change how we actually use that file or use that data? Well, over in my index.view.php file, the one that is the actual content for the index page itself, what we were doing before was I was using my colors array here in a for loop and pulling out a group of fields, which essentially was the inner array of the array of arrays that I had before. What's going to happen now is when I go through my colors array with this for each loop, what I'm going to end up with here is an object instead. Instead of calling it fields, I think maybe I'll just call it color singular. Down inside the actual table that's being created then, that means I'm going to need to switch over to that new variable name, color, and instead of the key, the array syntax with key that I was using before, I'm going to need to switch over now and use more of an object syntax. So of the color access, its name. Let's see here, calling color code for the fields. What I would need to do there is I would need to actually pass it the color object itself. Can do that. Here we have color code for the fields again. That again will be the color object. Over here we need the ID for my color. So color arrow ID. Same thing down here on the next couple lines. Color arrow ID. Color arrow ID. So just switching over to using an object instead of using that array that we had in there before. Overall, I think this probably stands a pretty decent chance of working except for this color code for function. The color code for function was expecting an array and we're now passing it an object, so there's really no reasonable way that that will probably continue to work. I should probably go visit that function real quickly before we give this a try. So back over in the color libs file, our color code for function that we have right here, what was happening in this function is we were passing it an array, a group of fields. Now we're passing it an object, which means down here, instead of accessing it as an array the way we were before, I just need to access it like it was an object instead. Kind of interesting in a way, the two are so similar, arrays and objects, both of them, at least at one level, being just a collection of different values. Pretty easy to swap back and forth between them in a logical sort of way. So there we are, color code for should work okay with an object now. So I have my color class, pretty fundamental, pretty basic at this point, but hopefully enough to actually get us started. I've modified my load color function, so when it reads in the data from the file, it uses that data to create objects instead of creating arrays. Those arrays of objects then are what gets given back to my index page when the index page requests it. And then in the view itself, I've modified everything so that it ought to be working with that object now. If everything comes off as planned, when we pull this page up in the browser, we should effectively see no change. Back in my browser, if I hit refresh, everything looks like it works just fine. So we're getting the exact same results now that we were getting previously using an array of arrays, only now we're using objects instead. So that's a good first step. Now, it's certainly not the last step that I want to take here. What I really want to do at this point is more or less wipe out my color library file. The color library file is a loose collection of different functions that all have to do with dealing with colors. And what I would like to do is I would actually like to take all of that and move it into my color class. I would like the color class to be the first and last stop when it comes to doing everything having to deal with colors. So how colors are loaded, how colors can be formatted in different ways, all of that functionality really belongs inside the color class itself. So back over on my index page, what I would really like is I'd like for this line to go away, no more color lib necessary, and this line I would like to at least change substantially. I'm still going to need my array of colors because the view requires that data to be able to display it for the user, but instead of accessing it through just a regular standalone function, I would like to access it through my class instead. There's a lot of different possibilities here on how this could potentially be put together. I could, for example, create a color object, something like that, so that I could then for that color object call a function, load colors. But that's almost sort of a silly thing to do. Why create a blank color so we can then ask that blank color to give us all the other colors? I think what I would really prefer here is to call some static function directly from the color class. I'm thinking maybe something called all, for example. I could say from the color class, give me all the colors, and that would then give me back an array of all of the color objects. So I think that's kind of how I would like for it to look. To create this new static all function, what I really basically want to do is I want to take my load colors function that I already have, and I, instead of having it there in the color library file, want to move it over to the color class instead. So I'm going to paste it in up here at the top of my color class, and I'm also going to go ahead and throw in a little bit of label here. I'm going to say static functions and attributes. This is just a comment, so of course it's not really doing anything all that special, but I want to now, before my class starts getting too long, go ahead and start organizing it a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm basically going to take my file, and not in an actual structural code way, but just with these comments, I want to split it up into the part of my color class where I'm going to put everything that's static, because I suspect that this function I'm getting ready to write won't be the last bit of it that will be static. And then down here at the bottom, I'll have all the things that are instance related. So essentially the stuff up here and what I'm thinking of as my static section is where I'll put everything from the class itself, dealing with the class itself. Whereas all the instance stuff down below will be all the different aspects of the actual objects that are created from the class. Let's go ahead and start putting that together. So for what I want for my all function here, I'm going to make a public static function. Instead of load colors, I'm going to call it all, and I'm going to say it's not going to be passed anything. I do still need somewhere to store the actual file name itself, and I could just hard code it into the function itself, but there's probably going to be other functions later that are also going to need that file name, so it might be advantageous to instead store it in some sort of class scoped variable that can always be accessed. So let me make a new private static variable. I'll call it file name. And I'll set the file name here to colors.txt. That should be the basic name of it. Down inside this new function I'm creating then, my colors array that I'm starting off with to store all the colors in should be pretty alright. I'm still pulling in all the data from my file. That's good, except to access my file name now I'm going to need to do self : $file name so that I can access the static variable that I have up there above. Going through each one of the individual lines then, exploding those lines, turning each one of those sets of data into a color object, storing all that data into the colors array, and then returning that colors array, I think should all still fundamentally work the same way. I guess the best way to find out would be to go give it a try. So let me jump back over to my index page, save it the way it is right now, and I just actually spotted something. Here, the colors lib file that I commented out because I wanted to get rid of it, well, I can't get rid of it quite yet. There's still a few functions in it I need, so I'm going to go ahead and uncomment that line for the moment, and we'll keep working on getting rid of that here. Let's see how things are in the browser at that point. Oops, looks like something definitely broke. Line 11 of my color file, it's telling me file colors.txt failed to open stream. Back over in my color file, line 11 right here is where I'm trying to open that file. It's using the file name that I gave it, color.txt. You could see in the error message that it did see that file name. Where I messed up was I forgot that the colors file isn't in the same directory as everything else. It's up one level. So let me do ../colors.txt. Back in the index file, if I'd been paying attention, I would have seen that's what I had been passing the load function before anyway. So let's give that a try. In the browser, refresh, and there we go. We seem to be working okay now with our static function over inside our color class, which means that line can actually go away permanently. There is one other little change I want to make to this all function though before we move on to the next little piece of this, and that's that I'm concerned that in the future there might be situations where I would call this all function more than once. What I'm thinking about is something like maybe on the show page where I would need to find one individual color. Well, the way I would probably end up doing that would be by loading all of the colors and then maybe finding the one color out of that all that we actually needed. I could see a potential situation where I could maybe purposely or inadvertently end up reading all my data from my file more than one time. So as an efficiency step, as a step I might want to put in to try to avoid reading from the file more than once per request, I think what I might like to do is to take my colors array and save it, so that essentially if the colors array has been loaded once, it will already be in memory and can be returned multiple times if I happen to require it. Here's what I think I'm going to do. I'm going to create another private static variable and I'm going to call it colors. I'm going to start the colors off as null, and then in the all function, I think I might say something like if colors is not null, meaning if there are actually colors in that colors variable already, except I guess if it's going to be a static variable, that'll have to be self : colors. So if my static colors variable is not null, then what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to return whatever's in that variable, which should be the array. And I'll say otherwise. Essentially, if it is null, then, just like we were before, we'll go through the process of actually loading the colors. Except when I load the colors, instead of it being a little local variable, the way that it is here, I think what I'll do instead is I will work with that static variable. So let me put self : in front of all the places where that's used. I think that's it. So my all function now just does this one extra little check. Instead of having the colors array stored only in the function itself, it now becomes something that's stored in the class as a static variable. It starts off null, so anytime a new page is first called up, the colors aren't loaded, so colors is null. The first time the all function is then called for that page, we'll see that colors is null, so we won't return the colors. Instead, we'll go through the process of actually loading the colors. When we load the colors, we will load them into that class-scoped static colors variable. We'll then return the content of that variable. So whichever page requested it will have a copy of that colors array to work with. Now, if for one reason or another we call all again, on that second try, we'll see that colors isn't null. Colors have already been loaded. So what we'll do instead is we'll return the colors we've already loaded. We will not go through and actually open the file and load the colors a second time. Let's give that a try real quick in the browser and make sure that doesn't cause any problems. It does cause some problems. Access to undeclared static property color, it says. Line 17. Line 17 right here. Oh, that one's actually not referring to the colors array. That was a local variable just called color. That's what I've always been talking about. I should be more careful when I make variables called color singular or colors plural. Too easy to get them confused. So let me take the self : off the front of that one and see if that fixes things. Yes, in the browser now, everything seems to load just fine. So with that extra little bit of efficiency in there, it looks like our all function is working just fine. All right, for our next step, back in the index file, I still want to get rid of my color library. Again, to do that, I need to take all of these different standalone functions that deal with colors, and I want to put them off into the color class itself. The next one I might look at then would be this color code for function. The way that function is actually being used is in the actual content of my index page. When I'm actually displaying the CSS or creating the CSS to display the background color for each one of my little color blocks, I call color code for that color. And I also use that color code for the text that shows up in the background of each one of those boxes. So the actual CSS generated color itself plus the text that appears in the box are both cases where I am taking the red, green, and blue values for a color and I'm combining them together into a single string using that function for convenience. I think the way that I would actually like for this to work is instead of me calling a color code for function, I think I'd like to be able to go to a color object and for that color object maybe call a code function. So I could have a color object, and for that color object, whenever I call its code function, I'd like it to return its red, green, and blue values together as a single string. So looking back over at my color class then, if I wanted to make that possible, I would need to add a new function. So I already have down in the instance part of my class functions for set and get. Let me add another new function down here. I'll call this new function code. Doesn't need to be passed anything. It's just going to be working with the values from the color object itself. And I'm just going to say return this object's red value and append to that this object's green value and append to that this object's blue value, red, green, and blue. So when I call each one of these this value statements, what I'm actually doing is calling the get function. The get function then will be going into my attributes array where the actual values of each one of these colors is stored. It'll be returning those values, and those values will all be appended together and then returned back to whoever called this code function. So in the index page, when I call the code function for a color, I should get back its red, green, and blue values as a single string. That should then mean that in my color lib file, my color code for function can go away. So let me go ahead and wipe that out. If I jump back over and look at it in my browser at this point, generally it looks like it works the same, but I noticed that everything went lowercase. I think maybe what we did before was we had a string to upper function call inside our color code for function that I did not put into my code function, but that'll be easy enough to fix. I can do string to upper in the code function whenever that's called for a color, and now everything's appearing as uppercase again, so easily remedied. In our color lib file, the only thing we have left at that point then is this color as string function. I think that color as string function is one that we actually put together for use probably on the new page, maybe the update page as well. What we're actually doing in this function was we were taking all of the 5 attributes of a color, appending them together with tabs between them and a new line at the end, basically the format that the color needed to be in to write it out to our data file. I could again mimic that fairly easily, moving this over to the class itself, and instead of putting it into a function called color to string, maybe what I'll do is I'll just put it into the special function underscore to string, so that anytime I try to represent a color simply as a string, the format it will come back in will be the format that it needs to be in order to be stored in our data file. All I need to do then is take this line that I just copied from my other function and switch it over so it's acting as a proper function inside an object would. So instead of referring to color, I'm going to need to refer to this, and instead of color or this being an array, it needs to just be accessing object attributes. So I'll get this object's ID, and then I'll append a tab to it. Then I'll get this object's name and append a tab to that. And then let me go ahead and switch over all the others, and I think that should do the trick. Since we don't really need this function right now, there's no way for me to test it in particular, but we might go ahead and just remember that that is there so that when we work with our new and our edit pages, we can hopefully make use of it. So I think at that point, I've accomplished the goal of wiping out my color library file. The color library file itself is now empty. On my index page, there's now no reason to require it anymore. I can actually go and delete the file itself. My index page now is down to just this. I require my color class, I ask my color class to give me all the colors, and then I render my template. When I render my template, it will use my index.view.php file to show the color content the way it should be shown on the index page, where I go through and I access each one of my colors as an object using its own attributes, basically calling the get function that we created, or calling functions that we've built into it specifically like code and later like the toString. In the browser right now, my index page appears to work just fine, no problems at all. So I think at this point we have successfully switched our index page over to working in an object-oriented way, and we have a good start on our color class, which we can now go on and see if we can make use of on the other pages of our Colors CRUD system.